All right, good afternoon, everyone. First, I need to apologize. There will be pizza. It will be here after the talk, so we apologize in advance for that. But welcome to our first official Science Luncheon series here at the Center for Vital Longevity here in the fall. It's my pleasure to welcome our speaker today, Dr. Candice Mills, Professor of Psychology here at the University of Texas at Dallas and Director of the Think Lab. Dr. Mills is a leading researcher in developmental psychology with a particular focus on how children learn from others and develop critical thinking skills. Her work examines how young minds assess explanations, identify trustworthy sources, and navigate the complexities of learning in social contexts. Dr. Mills earned her bachelor's degree in cognitive neuroscience from the University of Florida and her PhD in developmental psychology from Yale University. Her research integrates insights from cognitive, social, and educational psychology and spans developmental stages from early childhood through adulthood. She has received funding from the National Science Foundation and the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. And her work has been featured in prestigious journals like Psychological Science and Developmental Psychology, as well as in national news outlets like the New York Times and NPR. In addition to her research, Dr. Mills is a dedicated mentor and educator, recognized with numerous teaching awards, including the Regents Outstanding Teaching Award from the UT system. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Candice Mills.
I want to start off with talking about how much kids have to learn from other people. There are some things that kids and adults can figure out just from first-hand observation. So if you look at these two objects, you know immediately which one's larger. But there are so many other things that we have to have ideas from other people, testimony, claims, information from other people to make sense of them. For instance, knowing that the Earth is spherical. If you walk outside in Texas, I'm sorry, it looks flat to me. But we trust the scientists and the plethora of sources who say that the Earth is spherical. At least I imagine most of us in the room trust that claim. And kids do too. They take that information into account and adjust their understanding based on the testimony and claims of others. Knowing that germs are real, most kids don't see germs, but they see the effects of germs. They hear caregivers and teachers talking about germs. And so they incorporate this concept of germs into their understanding of their world. Understanding historical figures like Alexander Hamilton. This is not the real Alexander Hamilton. It's a musical about him. Understanding fictional characters like Santa Claus. All of these things rely on a combination of listening to other people, reading books, and sometimes using one's own observation skills or reasoning skills to make sense of these different kinds of claims. So given how much kids have to learn from others, there's this perspective that kids might need to be really, really trusting, right? There's this quote from Richard Dawkins. I've used it for years, but I really like it. With so many mind bites to be downloaded, so many mental codons to be replicated, it is no wonder that child brains are gullible, open to almost any suggestion, vulnerable to subversion, easy prey to moody Scientologists and nuns. This idea of kids needing to be really trusting because they have so much to learn, on one hand, it makes some sense. But on the other hand, it does seem like it's useful for kids to occasionally be able to think about what they're hearing, who they're hearing from, and evaluate it. I imagine many of you in this room are thinking to yourselves, yeah, but adults are really bad at this, right? Adults are sometimes quite flawed in deciding whether or not to trust the claims of others. And that's absolutely true. In general, when we're thinking about evaluating claims, we're thinking about different kinds of things that can influence us. We're thinking about the source of the claims, we're thinking about the claims themselves, and then we bring our own characteristics as a receiver to the table as we're evaluating information. So this is one model of epistemic vigilance, the idea that we don't trust everything. We trust some things, but we're open to the possibility and vigilant to evaluating the source, the content, and thinking through whether we should trust things or not. And so today I'm going to talk about some research that we've done in my lab with kids related to these questions. So why study these things with kids if adults are often so bad? Well, sometimes we want to start to see if kids are capable of things, even if they're not necessarily always good at it. So that's part of the puzzle. There's also this possibility, not only do things change over the course of development, but that there's individual differences in how good some kids are at evaluating claims. Just as adults, as you're looking around this room, I'm imagining many of these people in this room are pretty darn good at evaluating claims, thinking through the sources of claims, thinking through the content of claims. That's probably why you're in graduate school, because you can think deeply about this kind of thing. There's variation, and so trying to think about if there's variation that we might identify during childhood that might relate to strengths in adulthood, that's of interest as well. So I'll mention that in the 2010s, a lot of the research in my lab looked at how kids evaluate different sources of information. The basic idea when we're working with younger kids, we work with kids as young as 3 and as old as 12 to 13. We try to make things as simple and straightforward for the kids, depending on who our target audience is. In many of our studies looking at how kids value sources, we would present them with 2 puppets or 2 people live in front of them, or 2 people who've been recorded providing responses who are balanced in characteristics as much as possible so that they can really be focusing on whatever it is that we're varying. In some studies, we would present kids with like 1 informant who provided correct answers to familiar things like calling this a water bottle and this a pen, and 1 informant who made incorrect answers like called this a shoe and this a diaper. And then they had the opportunity to seek information from these sources in the future. We've done a lot of different kinds of studies like this. I'm not going to go into them in too much detail, but the basic idea, we find that even 4-year-olds tend to prefer reliable sources to unreliable ones in simple contexts. They're also sensitive to expertise. Kids know that different people know different things. Like they know their doctor knows more about health things than a car mechanic knows about health things. One thing we have seen is that kids sometimes have issues with prioritizing benevolence, like does this person or source seem nice or friendly, over competence or expertise. And I think that's something we sometimes struggle with as adults, getting focused on. This person seems friendly, they probably know what they're talking about. Today I want to focus on evaluating the method, which is another part of estimating. So imagine a child sees something they haven't seen before and asks a question. Mom, why do penguins have funny things in their back? This is my child Losman from a few years ago. He was happy to be a model at that time. He wouldn't want to be a model now, he's 11. But when he was like 6, he wanted to be a model for my study pictures. So he asked me this question, and if I gave a response like this, oh yes, penguins have such funny backs, don't they? This is the face he would make. He had no tolerance for bad answers to questions. And so he would screw up his face like, wait, what are you talking about? And kind of push to try to find more information. Not a helpful explanation. In contrast, if I said something like, penguins have scales on their backs to protect them from predators. Okay, that sounds fine. Yes, there's many follow-up questions you could ask, but the first kind of response was more aversive to him than the second kind of response. I'm interested in explanation quality, how kids make sense of explanation quality. There are a lot of things that go into explanation quality. Good explanations have certain features. In general, they tend to fill gaps in one's knowledge, move people forward in their understanding of something. They can lead to feelings of satisfaction. I imagine most of us have some point in our life where we've heard an explanation like, yeah, that sounds good, that makes sense. They can also lead to generalization and growth. So for instance, with the pangolin example, if you've heard that this kind of creature has these scales that help them to be protected, you might make that sort of generalization to other kinds of animals. It doesn't always lead to generalization, but it can be used for other kind of learning. Good explanations also have lots of different characteristics. So for instance, good explanations can vary in depth, but still be solid. So like, you can know that bees make honey, but you can also know that bees do something with nectar to make honey, and that's accurate. You can also know that bees convert nectar in their honey stomachs to simpler sugars that they then eventually convert to honey. And then you can understand that at a deeper level in terms of the chemistry of how bees make honey. All of these explanations might be good in some way. Maybe not the first one, bees make honey, that's kind of, but you may vary in terms of how much you care about the answer to questions, how deeply you want to know the mechanistic underlying parts to it. I think a key idea, though, is that good explanations have features that allow people to learn and grow and move forward. Weak explanations can also vary quite a bit in what they look like. In general, they do not fill gaps in one's knowledge. And in times, they can lead to feelings of tension or deprivation. So for instance, if you ask a question to one of your teachers and they give you an answer of like throwing you off like, oh, you should know that already, that may make you feel uncomfortable. That's not helping you move forward. And if you want to move forward, you may try to act to fill those gaps in one's knowledge. So today I'm going to be talking about 3 broad questions that we've been exploring in our research for the past 10 to 15 years. We've been interested in not only do children recognize weak explanations, but what sort of developmental differences do we see in their ability to recognize weak explanations? We're interested in what do they do when they encounter weak explanations? Does it encourage them sometimes to seek out resources to fill the gaps in their knowledge? And then what sort of things might contribute to children recognizing or responding to weak explanations? Again, sometimes it's interesting to understand what's changing developmentally just to know what kids are capable of when, but also they are in learning environments all the time, and sometimes things are wrong or biased or incorrect or trying to persuade them of things. And so understanding more about how they navigate that kind of world is helpful. And then thinking about what can we learn that might generalize as we get older into adulthood. Those are the kinds of things that we're interested in. So a couple big picture things before I get started with giving you some examples of specific studies. We often use examples in the domain of biology when we're working with kids. So we use biological items for many different reasons. One is that even young children are interested in biology. If you look at the first 50 words that kids speak, most kids will have a couple of animals in there: dog, cat, horse, bird, things like that. So it's super common for them to have those in first words. They ask many questions about biology. They go to places like zoos, but they also go for walks where they see lots of different animals. And so they're interested in animal functions and behavior. It's a rich explanatory domain where there's lots of different levels you can understand things. There's also not as much controversy when you're talking about things like pangolins as opposed to when you're talking about political kinds of issues where adults have very strong issues. So it's easier to get families to agree for us to do studies with kids thinking about biology than thinking about politics. We also have the opportunity to look at prior knowledge. We can do different kinds of assessments to measure how much they actually know about biology when they're engaging in these biology measures. And then there's also previously been a lot of interest in STEM learning, and biology is a part of that STEM learning. Most of the, if you look at the TEKS for Texas, a number of school years have biological components where they first start off talking about biological processes, and then they gradually get deeper as kids get further into high school, talking about mechanisms. And so biology is a part of those educational experiences. All right, so that's the domain we often use. And then in terms of weak explanations, what kinds of weak explanations do we use? Explanations can be bad for lots of different reasons. I imagine a lot of us have encountered bad explanations for different reasons. We've focused on 2 different types here: circular explanations and non-explanations. The way I define them may be slightly different than the way you might define them, but here's these examples. Circular explanations for us have been basically repeating information from the question without going any further. So it's kind of like going back on itself. Here's an example with how does making sounds help the bat find bugs for food? A circular explanation: the bat makes sounds so the bat can find bugs in the dark to eat for food. Okay, but how does making sounds help the bat? We got nothing from that. And then we also sometimes use non-explanations. Non-explanations for us have been things that were on topic but did not address the question. The bat can fly for a very long time at night and can live for over 20 years. Not relevant to how bats make sounds to help them find bugs for food. We sometimes have longer explanations. We sometimes have shorter ones. Sometimes it's about biology. There's going to be some examples we have a little bit later that are not about biology. But these are a start of simply weak explanations to see how much kids are able to detect weak explanations. When we're working with kids for these kinds of tasks, we use 2 different types of approaches for the explanation evaluation piece. Either a forced choice piece where there have 2 explanations pitted against each other, or a single explanation rating kind of approach. And so here's an example of a forced choice approach. You should hear us now in just a second. Why do tapirs have blurred eyesight? Let's see if this sounds.
Tapirs have blurred eyesight because they have an extra cloudy layer over their eyes that is hard to see through. Tapirs have blurred eyesight because everything they see is blurry to them when they look at things.
Which one was better, the first one or the second one? Easy peasy for you guys, right? For kids, they have to listen, so that requires some listening skills for the 2. But what we look at is see which one of these they prefer, and we can look at basically calculate a score performance for each individual child, and then look at it as a change over the course of development. Another approach we use is a single explanation approach, which is more similar to what we deal with in everyday life. You hear a news headline, it says something is happening with measles, here's the explanation, and you're forced to just think about that piece without a direct contrast. And so here's an example of how this works.
How do pink fairy armadillos use the thin white hair on their underbellies to stay healthy? Their underbellies have thin white hair that helps them not get sick.
So the more accurate answer to that, more informative, would be talking about how the thin white hair basically helps with the temperature regulation, keeps them from getting too hot or too cold. So after kids would hear one explanation, they would rate it in some way. And I'm going to give you an example of 2 scales we've used, but we've used lots of different kinds of scales in the past. We've had them indicate how complete their understanding, they felt like their understanding was after hearing it. We've had them rate how much information they think is missing from an explanation. We also had them use thumbs up, thumbs down scales. We've had them use happy face and mad face kind of scales. In general, there's not drastic differences between the scales, so I'm going to focus on some of the big picture findings here with the age groups that we're interested in. So many of the studies that we've done with the rating scales have focused on elementary school age kids, so roughly aged 5 to 10. And so this is an example graph from one of our studies. The y-axis in this case is rating, so that higher numbers means better quality explanation, and lower numbers means worse quality explanation. 3 means it's fine. And so looking at this graph, the orange is non-circular, like the more mechanistic causal explanations. The blue is circular explanations. Kids overall were distinguishing between the 2 types of explanations, rating the mechanistic ones that were non-circular as higher quality than the circular ones, which were, you heard them, they're not great. One thing I want to point out here, if you look at it developmentally, is that there's an interaction where the younger kids are less good at distinguishing between the explanations than the older kids. This is something that's come up again a few times here, where the younger kids are tending to see explanations as fine. They're still, in this case, rating the non-circular ones as higher in quality, but they're not rating the circular ones as terrible. And that's going to be something I'll come back to. Okay, yes?
To what extent do you think that effect might be due to younger children benefiting from a second pass of the information, just aiding language comprehension?
Yes, so I can mention a few things that we do. Depending on the version of the study, there's been times where they are navigating it themselves with a tablet and they can click for more, basically repeat it as many times as they want. And so I think that helps some with comprehension. We also have often given kids a verbal skills measure on top of this, and then a biological knowledge skills measure. And both of those things do tend to relate to how well they do at rejecting the non-explanations, basically rating the kinds of explanations, whether they're circular or not, lower. So I do think verbal skills are part of it. I think attention is part of it. I think motivation is part of it, which we'll get to in a few minutes. I think we're seeing them sensing some differences on average. There's a huge amount of variability in each age group, and that'll be something I'll come back to later on. Yes?
When you do analysis of which words are used, is it that the circular have more of the same words and the non-circular would have like more diversity of words and stuff? So are there other characteristics of like sentence structures or like the repetitions that would make those more distinct, and maybe that distinctiveness can be better detected?
And the older kids are better at noticing that this is giving some more information. Yes, by nature, the circular explanations, when we're contrasting those, tend to have the same kinds of words as in the prompt, the question. And so these older kids may be better at detecting that there's new words being shared and not necessarily a conceptual understanding of what's being shared. Other times we've had this contrast be more mechanistic explanations and then non-explanations, and those are pretty random in terms of the word structure, so that shouldn't be affected as much. So we tried to go younger with kids. We wanted to see how preschool age kids do at evaluating different kinds of explanations. We gave them some rating scales to start, and they struggled with the rating scales, rating everything as good. And so we decided to try to get them to sort explanations as helpful and not helpful. So they might hear a question and a response, and they would hear the response and say, does this help answer this question? How does music runs on water? And they had a little card, and they would put the card either in the helpful or the not helpful box. So we're trying to make it interactive for the kids. Not one box wasn't more exciting than the other, so they shouldn't have felt driven to do one box more than the other. They still had a tendency, at least in the domain of biology, to sort many responses as being helpful, regardless of whether they were mechanistic explanations or non-explanations for this study. So non-explanation is one it's talking about pink fairy armadillos, and it's remarking that they live in this certain part of the world. It does not address the question about the white hair on their stomachs. And in this study, this was another example of both verbal intelligence and biological knowledge related to basically sorting the bad stuff in that non-helpful box. So basically recognizing bad explanations more easily. More recently, in a study with my doctoral student, Elaine Liu, we have been trying to explore this a little bit further. Maybe part of the issue is we're using biological explanations and unfamiliar animals, and maybe that's tough. So let's make it super simple. And so we did a study where we worked on Zoom with kids as part of Project Garden, which is a large-scale developmental project with kids age 3 to 8. I'll talk about that in a few more minutes. Kids were presented with 4 simple riddles. I'll give you an example of a riddle here. Pat had to cross a big river to get home. Pat doesn't know how to swim, and there's no bridge anywhere, but he manages to cross the river without getting wet. How could that be? Trying to make it kind of interesting for the younger kids, posing the problem. We had it so for the 4 simple riddles, 2 of the responses were non-explanations, and 2 of the responses were explanations. So here's an example of a non-explanation. Pat liked to visit a big river to get home. In this case, it's just kind of giving back just really brief information of what he did. And then the river was not wet because it was frozen. Pat could simply walk across the ice. And so we would expect kids, if they could tell the difference between these, to rate that causal explanation as having more helpful information, being better quality than that non-explanation. And so for this one, we're working with younger kids. We used a 4-point scale where first we're asking them, is that a good answer? You can choose good or bad, and they can choose a lot good or a little good, a lot bad or a little good, a little bad, to try to get a sense of, are they thinking that this is a good answer to this question, or are they thinking this is a bad answer to this question? There's some other components to the project I'll talk about in a few minutes. But in looking at their ratings, kids did distinguish between causal and non-explanation overall. But again, there is an age and explanation type interaction. So the pink line here is their ratings for causal explanations. The yellow line here is the ratings for non-explanations. The age in months at the bottom is in the x-axis. So you have 5-year-olds around the 60 months age. And so you can see that kids in that 5-year or younger are not doing great at distinguishing between the 2 explanations in their ratings. Now, this is just in their ratings. The older kids are doing fine in their ratings of them, fitting with our previous research. So again, younger kids are struggling. One big issue I think kind of relates to what you were asking about in terms of their verbal skills or their attention, or what are they focusing on in terms of the explanations. Another piece of this is maybe rating is just really hard, especially when you're rating explanations on their own. And maybe it's better to look at things like, what are kids doing when they get a bad explanation? How are they responding to that? There's this idea that when we experience, we as adults, but we as kids throughout our life, when we sense that something is weak or incomplete or missing information, then in some cases we feel interested in engaging in some sort of learning behaviors to fill the gaps in our knowledge, whether it be a claim that somebody else has made or we're noticing something missing in our own knowledge. At times, we might be interested in moving forward to fill those gaps. This is related to the deprivation or information gap theory of curiosity, that sometimes our curiosity is driven by not knowing something. And not knowing something can lead to steps taken, whether that be checking out a book in the library, watching a video on YouTube, pulling a journal article, and then looking at another journal article and going down a rabbit hole of journal articles. Lots of different ways that can look depending on your age and your access to information. So maybe rating is tough. Maybe we need to look more at behaviors. And so I'm going to show you a few different studies that we've done to try to look at, do kids react differently, explore differently, show different kinds of curiosity after they've received some sort of weaker explanation. Maybe they're feeling some deprivation, they want to fill it, versus when they've experienced some sort of more complete explanation. So in one study, we presented kids with a tablet app that we had designed, where kids would see these 12 animals. They could click on whatever animal they wanted. Once they clicked on an animal, they would go to a screen where they would hear a little fact about the animal, a question about the animal, and somebody would respond to that question. So that's shown in that second slide there. Next, they were given the opportunity to rate the explanation. And then they were prompted with something like this. What do you want to do next? You can choose your next animal. So basically go back to that grid and choose another animal to listen to, or click for more information about this question. They were trained in this simple grid before this, so they were familiar with the idea of this before they went to this 12-1. The simpler grid was with familiar animals, not unfamiliar ones. There were some condition-related keys that I'm not going to talk about here, but the basic idea is that we wanted to see when would kids click for more information. Now, some of you in here might be that always click for more information. You always want to know more about whatever you're learning about. Others might be more selective. If there's gaps in your knowledge, that's when you want to click for more information. And there might be some like, I don't care, I'm not going to bother. And so we wanted to look at patterns of how kids respond. This was with the 7 and 10-year-olds. And so I'll just highlight main finding for one of the conditions. On average, kids requested information more often after circular explanations were given in that initial question and answer exchange than good explanations. And so a good number of kids, over the majority for the older kids and then 42% for the younger ones, were doing that. They were showing a pattern of selectiveness. I will point out there were also a number of kids who never requested more information. They just went through the grid, find out the basic ideas about the animals, and didn't dig for more information. And that may mirror what we see in everyday life with how some people don't seem to care about the answers to anything. They're just willing to get surface level understanding. But at least this showed to us that kids can show some of this deprivation curiosity, deprivation-driven curiosity. We also did a version of this where we presented kids with slightly different kinds of explanations. This is with my collaborator, Judith Vanovich, who's on a number of different studies related to explanations. Instead of it being completely weak explanations, there were explanations with gaps. And I'm not going to go into detail, but I'm happy to answer questions about that later on. So it's basically complete and incomplete explanations. After they heard one complete and one incomplete explanation, they were given the option of, after this, you can read a book about the answer to this question about badgers, or the answer to this question is about scatters. And it would be like a video sort of interactive book. And so we looked to see if they had to choose one of these books, which book would they choose? Would they choose the one that was about the incompletely answered question, or would they choose the other one, or was it seeming to be it? With this study, with elementary school age kids, they did tend significantly to prefer the reading the incomplete item book. But we also coded the choices, the reasons they provided for the choices that they made. And as usual, kids are really endearing when you ask them these kinds of questions. So some of them would say, that answer wasn't correct. It didn't help me. I wanted to find out more. That was not good. I wanted to find out more about that. And other kids would say things like, I like sea otters. And that was how they made their choice. But I think it's an important point. So sometimes kids are driven more by deprivation. Sometimes it's more like, I like this topic, and that's going to drive me more than whatever deprivation you've tried to set up as an experimenter. Another way we've tried to look at interest in getting more information is by a willingness to pay task. And this is something with my doctoral student, Yuli, related to the project I was mentioning earlier with riddles. And so in this task, as part of that larger study, before they began evaluating the riddles, they were asked to choose which of these 2 prizes they would like to have after the study, emailed to their parents so they can print them out and work with them. These are not very exciting prizes, right? They're like mazes and paper masks and things like that. I just want to point out these are not that exciting. They're not like stickers or new cars or whatever, but they're more exciting than no prize at all. So we wanted to see if kids would be willing to give up prizes for information. Are they willing to barter for information, basically? This kind of approach has been done sometimes with research with adults. The basic idea is we start off kids with a simple question of, would you like to have 3 of the prizes you chose, or hear directly from Pat about how that could have happened with them walking across the river and not getting wet? And so if they really wanted to find that information, they should choose Pat or whoever the character was in that story. If they really care more about the prizes, they should choose the prizes. And so if they chose the prizes, we would reduce the number of prizes. Okay, is information worth 2 prizes? Is information worth 1 prize? And then if they chose hearing from Pat, then we would ramp up the prizes to see how much information, how many prizes is this information worth? So in the end, the scale could be giving up 1 prize or not being willing to give up 1 prize and being willing to go up to all the way to 5. These were 3 to 8-year-olds. I'm saying this, again, think about what those prizes were. Our kids were not very willing to give up prizes for information. The y-axis here is 1 to 5, and so very few kids wanted to give up any prizes for information in this study. Older kids were more likely to be willing to give up a prize, but giving up prizes was pretty rare. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It's good to be aware of. In this case, the answers to the riddles were not enticing enough for them to want to give out some prizes. So I want to take a step back here, talk about what I've talked about so far, and then go in a slightly different direction that relates to these questions. So big picture, kids sometimes recognize weak explanations. There's a tendency for younger kids to struggle to rate many, by rating many explanations as helpful. Some of that may be due to language issues, some of that may be due to scales. We do see that domain-specific knowledge and verbal intelligence matter. And then we do see some evidence that when kids encounter weak explanations, they sometimes seek additional information, although not always. And that's probably like we are as adults as well. We're not always interested in figuring things out. So one of the things that this research led me to do is to talk a lot with my kids as they were getting older to try to understand more about, well, what do you think makes you interested in following up on things? And they pointed out this idea that there's sometimes where they hear an explanation that has gaps, that they feel skeptical and frustrated, or like annoyed, and they want to find out the real answer. And there's sometimes they're like, whatever, it doesn't matter. This is my son's whatever face. But I think it was a reasonable point. There are times where we encounter explanations that we just don't care about evaluating, or we can sense something's wrong, but we don't care enough to do anything. And so one of the things we've been thinking about in our lab these last few years is, okay, well, why do we sometimes care? What can we do to ramp up caring, both for kids and they're in school and also as adults when they're confronted with information? I know things get very messy when we're dealing with adults, given the complexity of the topics and their own personal interest in them. But let's explore this sort of thing with kids. So what might contribute to children being willing or able to respond and recognize weak explanations? So obviously child-specific factors, we've talked about this before, domain-specific knowledge, perhaps more domain-general cognitive skills and abilities like verbal abilities. Related to this, for the project I mentioned with riddles, we have a great opportunity to look back and connect to some other data that we collect as part of Project Garden. So I mentioned Project Garden earlier. I'll just give a quick overview of what that project was. This was an NSF-funded collaborative project where we wanted to use the internet to make developmental science better, to try out a model for making developmental science better. So families can visit the website childrenhelpingscience.com. It's still there, and families can still participate in research studies that aren't part of Project Garden. It's always open. But we had a special component on there called Project Garden, where we encouraged families to participate in 16 research modules via computer. Many of the studies were asynchronous. So basically the computer would record the child in terms of their clicks and their video, and that would be the way their measure was taken. And then some of the measures were Zoom studies or team studies where they were interacting with an experiment virtually. The first phase was a bunch of individual difference measures. These were kind of voted on by the field of cognitive development in terms of what we should include in this initial battery. Include a vocabulary measure, an executive functioning measure, a few other reasoning types of measures. In the family survey, we also had some demographics as well as some parent reports of how they talk with their kids about science and parent reports of their beliefs about their child's curiosity. So for the study that I was mentioning about the riddles, we can connect how kids rated the explanations with some of this background information about their vocabulary skills. That's one of the primary things we think will relate to their ability to evaluate these explanations, and also their executive function skills, see how that connects to variability in their performance. So I think this kind of model could be helpful for developmental science work. It is really hard to get kids to sit still for 2 hours to do a battery of tests. Some of you have experienced this before. And so anything we can do to try to bring more kids to science in a way that's less overwhelming, having things be online really does have the potential of increasing access to families. You don't have to go to university, you can just do it online. We're not there in terms of the diversity of who's participating yet, but I think there's a lot of hope. So we're definitely still interested in looking at these child-specific factors, how they relate to how kids make sense of explanations, and really their epistemic vigilance more broadly. We're also interested in motivational factors and how they might relate to how kids are evaluating explanations. How much do they care about knowing the answer to these questions? For simplicity's sake, a lot of our studies involve experimenter-provided questions and explanations. We usually come up with the questions first by talking with kids, but it doesn't mean that that specific kid is interested in that specific question. And so there may be some ways to try to constrain a set of topics that kids could ask questions about, but then prompt them to ask questions. There are other researchers who've gotten kids to ask questions for studies, and then design some possible responses to see how they do when it's questions that they're asking themselves. I'm happy to extend that later on if you're interested. And then a final area that we've been exploring is basically how parents might model managing weak explanations and knowledge gaps. I'll take you on a little bit of a journey here. I promise it'll make sense. There's this construct called intellectual humility, which is the idea that some people vary in terms of how much they're willing to recognize limitations in their own knowledge and understanding. Being able to be intellectually humble is an important part of being a researcher, right? Because you have to be willing to consider that your predictions might be wrong and to look at the evidence that you have and adjust your understanding according to that evidence. Intellectual humility in adults has been found to relate to a lot of helpful things, both in terms of evaluating one's own knowledge and evaluating claims from other people. It's not exactly the same thing as smarts, because you can be intelligent on a test and not necessarily be willing to be humble about things. So we've been really interested in the idea that maybe parents could model intellectual humility with their kids. Maybe they can do something in a way that helps kids be more epistemically vigilant. So being intellectually humble can be hard. Tanel Porter has done a lot of research on intellectual humility in adults and then high school students. She created this diagram. It's a big diagram, so I'm going to focus your attention on this idea. She's been interested not only in the development of intellectual humility in these older samples, but also what might be threats to people being willing to notice gaps in their knowledge. And some of the things she points out, metacognition may matter. Maybe there's times where you're just not aware that you have gaps in your knowledge, or there's gaps in what other people are saying. But she also points out this idea that some people may be intolerant of being uncertain. They may feel like uncertainty is an aversive kind of state. And so maybe if parents can help kids become more tolerant of uncertainty, that will help them to be more willing to admit when they're uncertain and more open to noticing uncertainty out there in the world, as opposed to assuming that everything's black and white, everything's fine, everyone knows exactly what they're talking about at the end. So what would it look like to actually demonstrate intellectual humility for kids? Well, if a kid asks a question, sometimes the parent might respond with the correct answer. There's not as much room for intellectual humility then, because the parent is giving some correct information. They could still model, well, here's some things I don't know. We could look these up. But a way parents can really demonstrate intellectual humility is when they don't know something and they show it to their child. Like, I'm not sure, but I think this. Or I'm not sure, I have no idea, and they don't even try to answer it. Or by referencing looking up information, I'm not sure, let's Google it. Let's look up a YouTube video. Let's ask your dad, those sorts of things. It may be particularly helpful when parents don't know the answer to things, and they mark their response in that way. So if they are going to say either a wrong answer or just no answer, just making it clear as opposed to making stuff up. It is surprising how unwilling parents are to make stuff up when kids have questions. Not to say that that's bad, but it may be giving kids some confusion about what the true state of the world is. It may be difficult for them to grow. Do parents talk in this way with kids? Absolutely. It's a project by one of my other doctoral students, Natalie Quintero. Parents were mentioning uncertainty much more often when they themselves found a question to be more difficult. So parents use uncertainty in that way, on average. But there's also a fair amount of individual differences in how much parents use uncertainty in their explanations. In one of our projects, we found that parents who are more authoritarian were less likely to mention uncertainty in their explanations. We also know that parent modeling in other ways relates to children's reasoning about things like evidence, using metacognitive talk, things like that. And then other researchers have thought that IH can be modeled. So doing things like we're human, can learn from one another's mistakes. I'll admit when I make mistakes. I'm not sure, giving those sorts of labels for things. And so I'll briefly overview what we did for this project. We had a child component for this and a parent component for this. The child component for this project was a knowledge estimation task. So instead of them looking at other people's claims, it was their own ideas, but they were using a rating scale. They're still evaluating their own explanations, it's just their own explanations here. So 1 to 5 rating scale, they were asked questions about common animals and vehicles, as well as uncommon animals and vehicles. Where should the intellectual humility show up? Ratings for common or ratings for uncommon? What do you think? Probably uncommon, right? So when you are less likely to know something, you should be rating your knowledge lower. And so what we had anticipated is that we would see kids rating their knowledge lower for uncommon than common animals and vehicles, but we also expected there to be a good amount of variability with their ratings for their knowledge for the uncommon. I wanted to see what related with those ratings. Briefly, we used 2 parent measures. One of them was a self-report of intellectual humility. I won't go into great detail. It's a more comprehensive intellectual humility scale that doesn't just focus on gaps in one's knowledge, but it's getting at the idea that maybe intellectual humility is a trait. We can argue about that, but it is trying to measure parents' perceptions or adults' perceptions of their own intellectual humility. We also had parents complete the prompted explanation task, which is a computer-based method of looking at parents' explanations. Briefly, when we're working with parents and kids, it is super hard to do naturalistic recordings of conversations and track them down and code them for kids' questions and parent explanations. People do that for sure, but one way we can start to get at what's going on is to have parents pretend like they're answering questions to their child out loud, and then we record it. And so we have parents identify a specific child before they start the study, and then the computer prompts them, hey, your child is asking this question, go. And they just record how they would respond. So we go in and then we transcribe and code. We code for lots of different things. Here I'm going to be talking about the presence and absence of these intellectual humility things, like recognizing gaps, talking about what makes up, things like that. Okay, I want to highlight some quick things first before we get to some conclusions. In general, as expected, kids in this age range, 7 to 10, did rate common items, their knowledge for common items higher than uncommon. There are some kids who probably knew a lot about everything, and we did not have the time to record all of their responses to these questions. So that would be something we want to check to see how well calibrated children's ratings are with their own knowledge, different direction. But there was significant variability in their ratings for uncommon items. So we wanted to see how parents' self-reports of intellectual humility and how their behaviors related to kids not rated for their knowledge. And so briefly, we found that parents who reported that they had higher intellectual humility, self-reports were higher, had kids who rated their own knowledge for uncommon items higher. So basically, the parents who are like, I'm so humble, had kids who are like, I know a lot, which was not expected given how people have talked about this measure of intellectual humility in the past. In contrast, when parents provided basically fewer unmarked incorrect answers, basically they didn't give kids a bunch of bad answers without marking them, they marked their incorrect answers with saying like, I'm not sure, or I think it's this, but let's look it up. Kids of those parents rated their knowledge for uncommon items lower. So we're seeing this distinction between the self-reports and what parents are actually doing, and how it connects to kids' behavior.
The parents reporting, do they report it? It's those who are reporting themselves as a higher, or you.
So parent reports of intellectual
humility actually that objectively, no, they don't.
So parent reports of their own humility had nothing to do with how they answered the questions. I've had some concerns about these sort of general trait level intellectual humility measures. If I ask everybody in here, are you humble? Are you intellectually humble? If you feel like you should answer yes, I'm worried sometimes you might. There's still plenty of evidence with adults that it does connect to behavior on some reasoning tasks and some communication tasks. So I do think there's something real there with that measure in terms of how people are handling reasoning, but it also didn't translate into how they were talking with their kids. So maybe we need more specific about, are you okay showing humility in front of your child as something separate than this?
The things like the uncertainty and tolerance of uncertainty, this is part of the measure of the intellectual humility for the parent questionnaires?
Yes. So the parent questions include things like, when someone disagrees with ideas that are important to me and it feels like I'm being attacked, that's reverse coded. So I'm willing to change my mind once it's made up about an important topic. It's not quite the same thing as uncertainty tolerance, but the idea is that when parents score high on this, or adults score high on this, they are more open to learning their ideas are wrong and listening to other people and being uncertain. So there's some practical things we need to think through about what these measures are. But it did seem interesting to see this link between parent behavior. The parents who modeled intellectual humility had kids who showed more humility when they were rating their own knowledge. Promising. So maybe there's something there about modeling from adults that uncertainty is okay, not aversive. Maybe that helps kids be more open to noticing their own weaknesses, maybe more open to recognizing gaps and explanations, to be determined. I do think there's something there related to what sort of guidance kids are getting at home and in their schools about how to approach not knowing things, if it's even okay to not know things. Highlighting a few big picture things in our research. So yes, kids can sometimes notice weak explanations. There's lots of different things that can contribute to that. Kids sometimes act to follow up on weak explanations. A lot may depend on how motivated they are or how intriguing or exciting the alternative is. There's this possible evidence that adult modeling may help children to be more open to acknowledging knowledge gaps. There's a lot that we could unpack there about those relations. Big picture and moving forward, we are interested in not just this idea of recognizing knowledge gaps, but other things that caregivers and schools can do that make kids more comfortable with uncertainty and recognizing gaps and things like that. So anecdotally, both of my kids will say they have had teachers who don't like questions, and that makes them feel like it's not okay to ask questions in class. You keep your questions to yourselves. There's also other things that might impact how comfortable they feel, like noticing knowledge gaps. Like if they feel like everybody's smart in the room, they may not want to admit when they don't know things. So it's complicated for sure, but I do believe there are things that we can do to set kids up for being more open to being wrong and being more open to learn and expand on their knowledge of things. I also think this motivational piece is important, examining more about what can help kids to be more interested in getting to the bottom of things with trying to understand, is this accurate or not, what's missing here? And I do think we can build from these kinds of findings to help adjust discussions about evidence and about reasoning in classroom settings to help kids be more open to thinking about uncertainty. More broadly, I think that when kids are learning about the world, there is so much they don't know, and they do have to rely on information from others. I'm not saying they should doubt everything, but I do think an important part of development and adulthood is to be able to step back and be epistemically vigilant as you need to be able to be aware sometimes you shouldn't trust things, sometimes you should follow things up, things like that. So my hope is that this kind of research can help us to better prepare kids for living in our world. So it is. Thank you. I want to thank my funders. I'll mention the Developmental Intellectual Humility team, also the Project Garden team, and then my two doctoral students, Natalie and Yelene, and then my lab. All right, thank you. So I was really looking forward to the opportunity to talking with you all. I was trained as a cognitive neuroscientist, as she mentioned earlier on, and I've been away from neuroscience for a while, but I do think that there's lots of different kinds of approaches to examining things like reasoning and trust and memory and processing and things like that. So I'm excited to hear other people's perspectives.
This isn't a neuroscience question. I'm sure it's one you've thought about a lot, but I can't help but be struck by the fact that much of what you described, this is not criticism, it's an observation essentially, is concerned with children who are experiencing culturally very specific kind of upbringing, where you go to elementary school, you go to school, you've got parents who interact with you, and you become literate fairly early on in life. How do you think the kinds of things you've been talking about generalize? How would you explore how kids learn about the difference between weak and strong explanations in very, very different cultures? For example, cultures where you probably don't learn to read until you're 8 or 9 years old. Cultures where you don't have a structured educational experience from age 4 onward and the like. It seemed a lot of your tests were predicated on the assumption that there was a lot of background to children in the first place.
Yeah.
So how would you extend the kind of work that you're doing to look at what would happen with what's probably the majority of the children in the world who don't have this kind of cultural experience?
Thank you. So I'll mention a couple of things there. Like I had said, for doing a lot of biological explanations, in part this was because of the reasons I mentioned with explanations having various degrees of depth, and because NSF wanted to fund things on STEM, we can make this STEM. But I do think outside of these formal education settings, there are still plenty of opportunities for kids to be interacting with others and hear incorrect claims. They are out by the water. Some people are doing some work. Somebody tells them, oh, there's something wrong with water. You can't go over there. And they go back home and the mom's like, what are you talking about? You have to go there. And so it's like an everyday interaction opportunity where they're being told something that's incorrect and they have to evaluate it. So I don't think there's a formal education need for that to happen. I do wonder how much kind of talk kids are getting that are getting them to think about quality of sources, quality of information in those contexts. It probably varies in terms of what kinds of activities there are, what kind of explanations are in those sorts of activities. So if your everyday life is very much focused on the chores that you have to do, where you don't really have to understand much about them, it probably is going to need less intense inspection than if you're trying to understand about how to take care of people who are sick. You have these routines of what you do, but you're trying to understand more about why you do one thing over another. So I'm going to guess it's going to vary in terms of what's happening everyday life and what kind of exposure. But I think all of this can happen in social contexts outside of specific domains of science, for instance. Yes.
One thing I thought about whenever during your discussion of the information search paradigm and whether or not they wanted to click the button on for more information,
Yeah.
I was thinking about whether or not they would trust that clicking on that button would actually get them more information. Because if I just got an explanation that was circular, why would I think that
Yeah.
clicking on that button would actually get me a reasonable explanation if I just got a poor explanation or weak explanation?
Yeah.
So have you thought about that, or have you thought about, giving them maybe choices where they're picking from among multiple sources of information?
Yes. So I think with that one, we had an initial training experience where they understood that regardless of what they got initially, sometimes they hear good explanations, sometimes they would hear bad ones, but when they click for more, they would always hear something better.
Okay.
But we've also addressed this in different kinds of ways with some of our follow-up research. So one thing we'll do sometimes is you could learn more from this source about the same topic, or you could go to someone else for information. And so if kids feel like this person's giving me a bad explanation, but I still want to know the answer, maybe they'll go to that other source. And so I think that can help them to, they're really interested in knowing the answer. It's not tied to us. They don't have to talk to the person who's giving them the bad answers.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. Really fun, really interesting, and kind of thought-provoking ideas, right? I'm kind of the main question I have is your thoughts about the applicability of those ideas for the adult sphere of social media, information seeking routines, or just in general adults and their ability to kind of identify good and bad explanation for it. That's kind of a general idea, and I think a more specific basically this all ideas kind of puts more emphasis on the receiver in your ideas, right? Because and their prior knowledge, their convictions, and how can you kind of build more tolerance for uncertainty, or more tolerance for evaluating information that is now, maybe the weak explanations are very consistent with prior knowledge.
Right. And prior beliefs.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. So I think back to this, see if this will work. The model that I was mentioning earlier on with thinking about the different kinds of strength vigilance. You guys can see it. Where the basic concepts, I think, are relevant here, where adults are having to think through the sources and think through the claims. But they are, as the receiver, bringing a lot of background knowledge, but that knowledge may be biased knowledge that they're bringing, that they feel like it's factual. And so in some cases, what we're doing with kids is seeing what's plausible without a lot of bias muddying the waters. As the waters get muddied with people's personal beliefs that they feel like are knowledge, then I think that there's a much more difficult task for the receiver to be able to recognize gaps when they have such strong convictions about things that may or may not be solid to begin with. So some of what I'm interested in is this idea is, if there's this real thing of intellectual humility that's more trait-like, can we foster it so that once kids get into adolescence and adulthood, they have this willingness to notice gaps, like, oh, actually, I used to believe this, and I'm realizing this may not be right. So maybe that can help them be a little bit more likely to be more sophisticated as the receiver receiving information. The source stuff and the claim stuff is really hard as the environment becomes even more polarized, right? Because people go to different sources for the information. The reason they're going to these sources is they repeat back what they want them to hear. So I think it's worth exploring how much of this kids carry with them into adolescents and adults in terms of a trait to approaching information. And also I think it's worthwhile in childhood and adult and adolescence to start trying to explore areas where kids are going to have some biases. There are a few studies done by some of my friends in the field that try to get a sense of when kids have a prior belief about something, like a really strong belief about something, even if it's a scientific misconception, how willing are they to revise their beliefs based on new evidence? So for instance, there's these balance scale problems that people can have. Probably remember that people had a lot of issues with understanding how balance scales work. And if you move the fulcrum, what will happen to the balance scales? There's lots of misconceptions there. And so people come in with strong misconceptions, and then they have evidence that goes against their misconceptions, and it can be really hard for them to struggle to accommodate. But I think building from scientific misconceptions may help, and then also going to other areas where people have really strong feelings about what they know and don't know, and exploring around that willingness to be intellectually humble when exploring those ideas. Lots of interesting stuff to do.
So
Yeah.
Do kids share the Dunning-Kruger effect?
Yes. The kids show the Dunning-Kruger effect. Yes.
They do.
So one of the things, one of my first projects when I was a graduate student was having kids estimate how much they knew about something, and they provided explanations, and we wanted to see if they dropped their knowledge ratings after they provided explanations. Kids would overwhelmingly overestimate how much they knew.
Okay.
Providing explanations would help the kids by around age 6 or 7 on average to drop in their ratings. The 5-year-olds, not surprising for anybody who's studied memory sorts of stuff, the 5-year-olds were really bad at adjusting their self ratings after they provided really bad explanations. We didn't push them too hard because we didn't want to make them. No, that's wrong. That's wrong.
So that's very like adults then.
Yeah.
So that bias to overestimate your competence
Yes.
is there from almost the get-go.
Yes. And you're starting with your own information of the world, right? Kids are in their families, sure, they have lots of social information, but the thing they perceive the most is their body and their brain and whatever they sense and whatever they think and whatever they feel. And so to some extent, some of that overestimation, they don't have, and this is the main information they have, they're not great at comparison. They get better, but yes.
Is there a reverse thing? Like the more you know, the more you don't know?
Yeah.
Yes.
That's the effect.
That's-
And so we found that with a few of the studies with kids where the kids who rate their knowledge the lowest, if we've actually gotten them to provide an explanation, they tend to be providing more sophisticated explanations than people who rated their knowledge really high. I'm sure you experience this as a science teacher sometimes, where people are like, oh, I don't know this, and you're looking at their answers on the test. Yes, it doesn't always happen, but you can see that even in young kids, even in elementary school age kids, where there's some variability there.
That's nice.
Yes.
On the way over, I was actually listening to Hearing Now, and they had a brilliant example of your intellectual humility for something we're likely all aware of, which is hallucinations in AI. And the example they brought up, interesting to yours, was asking AI about the fastest crossing by foot across the English Channel, which it obviously displayed a name and the amount of time and a year and date. So very relevant to the example that you provided. But I'm curious if what you're learning here about these cognitive processes could prove informative in the training, not only of children, but of these learning tools in order to have them display more intellectual humility or respond in ways that recognize that the answers they're providing could be less than perfect.
I love that. I mean, there seems to be some missing logical check in that kind of example, which you feel like a system should have if it's going to provide explanations. Like, I'm not sure, but I think it was this. Even that ability to step back would be really helpful to build in.
It's not in the training set.
Well, because people are really bad at doing it. So they're feeding a bunch of people who aren't providing intellectually humble responses. But yeah, that's a good example.
Yeah.
It's also very scary. Yeah.
Camilla, is there anyone online?
We have no questions online.
Ian?
Yeah, I think like related to that, I think it's really could be related to social evaluated concern or ego threat.
Yeah.
So like some kids may think if I say that I need more information, I don't understand it. Maybe other people could think it's not smart enough, but
Yeah.
I don't want to admit that I don't smart enough.
Yes.
So have you like linked into temperament, or have you thought about like manipulating social evaluated constraints?
Yes. So this came up in a conversation with Kendra, kind of related to this, but related to the social component recently. So I'll mention a few things here. I do think that happens sometimes with kids. One thing that we've varied in our studies is, who are they rating their knowledge for? Is there an experimenter looking at them? Are they rating it on a computer? Things like that. We haven't done that within the same study to compare how they're doing. But I do get the sense that sometimes kids don't want to admit that they're wrong or that they might not know something. That may be why we see this link between parents self-report of, oh yes, I'm so intellectually humble, and their kids being like, yeah, I know a lot about the uncommon items. Maybe there's that social component there for whatever reason. Those parents who have this, feel like they have this trait that they're intellectually humble, have kids that are like, oh, I know a lot, I really know a lot. We don't know. I can also say that we sometimes will give kids a social desirability scale along with things. So for those who don't know, sometimes kids want to respond in the way that the adults around them want them to respond. And so you can give them a scale where there's some questions they should not say yes to. And if they say yes to a lot of them, then they are trying to respond in a socially desirable way. And we have not related how that measure relates to their own ratings of their own knowledge. The part of the reason why we've looked at a lot of things about explanations from others is in part because that's what they're encountering in the world. Lots of testimony, lots of claims. But even then, kids may have trouble admitting that's not full, that's not complete, because it may make them feel like I'm missing something, I'm a dummy, it's wrong with me that I don't know what's going on there. And so worth studying in social context, worth studying to see how the social context might be influencing kids' comfort in admitting their uncertainty.
All right. I think last chance.
I'll be around for a little bit after while you're getting your pizza.
All right. Thank you.